What happens when a nation's hope is just completely gone? Today, we're diving into this powerful story from the book of Ezra. It's about a people who lost literally everything, only to be brought back home by a God who never ever breaks a promise. It's an incredible story of faithfulness and restoration against all odds.
Okay, so to really get this story of return, we first need to look forward a bit to a prophecy just brimming with hope. The prophet Zechariah spoke of this coming king, a righteous and victorious one. This promise of a future, ultimate restoration kind of sets the stage for the physical homecoming we're about to see. It's a huge reminder that God's plans are always, always bigger than whatever crisis is happening right now.
But before that promised king could come, the people had to live through a pretty grim reality. Their present wasn't victory, it was total defeat. We're talking about a nation that was completely broken, living in exile, and just deep in despair.
Yeah, after decades of turning away from God, the consequences were, well, they were devastating. The nation's leaders, their artisans, their thinkers, the very heart and soul of the culture were all forcibly marched off to Babylon. Just try to imagine that loss. The text describes those left behind as a threadbare bunch, basically a remnant serving a foreign king in their own land. And this wasn't some short-term problem. We're talking 70 years. That's long enough for an entire generation to be born, live their whole lives, and die in a foreign land, only knowing their homeland through stories. It all kicked off in 586 BC when Babylon didn't just conquer Jerusalem, they ripped the heart out of the nation. And this was the knockout blow. The temple wasn't just some fancy building. It was the place where God's presence symbolically dwelt with his people. So, when it was destroyed, it felt like their physical connection to God had been completely severed. They were cut off, spiritually and geographically, from the very one who gave them their identity. But even in all that darkness, there was a promise. God had not forgotten his people, not at all. In fact, he had a very precise plan for their return. And this is what's just so incredible. The end of those 70 years, it wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't some lucky geopolitical shift. No way. The prophet Jeremiah had actually declared that God would bring them home after this exact amount of time. This whole story really hinges on one thing. God keeps his word. So how does this all happen? How does this promise come true? Well, it doesn't start with a rebellion or some political movement by the exiles. It starts with God directly intervening in the heart of the most powerful man on the planet. The book of Ezra uses a really specific verb here, rouse. It means to stir up, to awaken. The text says that God actively roused the spirit of King Cyrus of Persia, a pagan king, not just to free a conquered people, but to actually pay for them to go home. This was a deliberate, sovereign act of God. And this just perfectly illustrates the complete 180 God pulled off here. The Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar had taken all the sacred items from the temple as trophies, right? To prove his gods were stronger. But now, the Persian king, Cyrus, is stirred by God to return those exact same items for the purpose of worship. It's a jaw-dropping display of God's power over all rulers. And God's action here was twofold. See, it wasn't enough to just open the door. He also had to get the people to want to walk through it. What's amazing is that the Bible uses the exact same Hebrew word for roused to describe what happened to King Cyrus and what happened to the Jewish leaders. God created the opportunity, and he inspired the response. And God didn't just send them home empty-handed. He sent them home fully provided for. Their neighbors gave them supplies, which is a clear echo of how the Israelites were supplied when they left Egypt. King Cyrus even gave back all the stolen temple vessels, fulfilling yet another specific prophecy from Jeremiah. This was nothing less than a new Exodus, completely orchestrated and supplied by God. Okay, so the people are on their way home, they're funded by a foreign king, and they have their sacred items back. So the big question is, what do they do first? I mean, really think about it. Their homes are gone, the city walls are just piles of rubble, there's no economy. With 1,000 things that need to be done, what would be priority number one? Where'd you even start? One word: worship. Before anything else, their first priority was to restore their relationship with the God who had so faithfully brought them home. And their priorities here tell you everything. Before they laid a single stone for the new temple, before they even worried about building walls for defense, they rebuilt the altar.
right on its original foundation. That single act declared that their relationship with God was the foundation for everything else they were about to do. So, what was the point of these offerings? Well, the burnt offering was a powerful object lesson. It taught the people that their sin, the very thing that got them exiled in the first place, deserved judgment, which is death, and that to be reconciled to a holy God, a substitute had to pay that price for them.
And make no mistake, this was a radical act of faith. The Bible says they did this even though they feared the surrounding peoples. They were totally vulnerable, surrounded by neighbors who might not be too happy to see them. But their very first public act was to declare their total dependence on God alone for protection.
This powerful act of rebuilding the altar, it actually points to an even deeper truth. The sacrifices they were offering, they were a shadow. And this story helps us understand the reality they were always pointing towards.
You know, the New Testament makes this crystal clear. The animal sacrifices were never the final answer. They couldn't permanently take away sin. They were a temporary fix, a placeholder pointing to something and someone much greater. This right here is the key. The sacrifices weren't about removal, they were about reminder. They were a constant, visible sign of the separation that sin causes. Year after year, they pointed forward, creating this deep need for a perfect, final sacrifice that could truly bring people back to God. And this is where the story finds its ultimate fulfillment. That altar they rebuilt in Jerusalem, that was the shadow. The reality is the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. His death wasn't another reminder of sin. It was for the permanent removal of sin, offered once for all people, for all time. So in the end, this incredible story from Ezra is so much more than just ancient history. It's a living, breathing picture of the gospel itself. It's the story of God in his absolute, unwavering faithfulness, taking the first step and doing all the work to bring his people back home to himself. And that kind of brings us to a final thought, a personal one. The ultimate sacrifice has been made, so we don't need an altar made of stone anymore. Instead, in response to God's incredible grace and restoration, we're now called to be a living sacrifice. So the question for us is, what does that actually look like in our daily lives, at work, at home, in our neighborhoods? That's definitely something worth thinking about.